Canada is undertaking a significant overhaul of the international trading system, signaling a dramatic shift in its economic strategy. Just yesterday, the country announced a pause on a global framework of reciprocal tariffs, excluding China, which has sent shockwaves through the electric vehicle (EV) supply chain. This unexpected move has disrupted operations at companies like Tesla and cast uncertainty over the United States' clean energy goals. The announcement marks a major and surprising turn in North America's trade landscape, catching many off guard. Traditionally known for its measured and diplomatic approach, Canada has now taken an uncharacteristically bold stance that is already straining its historically stable trade relationship with the US. The newly introduced trade policies focus on reshaping the North American auto industry by suspending broad tariff reciprocity and implementing targeted measures. Central to this shift are new tariffs and export restrictions on critical raw materials, nickel, lithium, and aluminum, all essential components in electric vehicle battery production and modern automotive manufacturing. For decades, Canada and the United States have shared a robust economic partnership, built on mutual understanding and cooperation. Their close ties, particularly in manufacturing and transportation, have long been underpinned by the world's longest undefended border. However, Canada's latest decision challenges this foundational assumption, serving as a wake-up call and potentially marking the beginning of a broader realignment in regional trade dynamics. The production of these materials goes far beyond mere commodities; they form the backbone of the electric vehicle (EV) revolution. Tesla, a major force in this space, has long depended on a reliable and affordable supply of critical resources from Canada. However, that once stable supply chain has been disrupted, and the impact was felt almost immediately. While Tesla's gigafactories in Nevada and Texas, central hubs for large-scale battery manufacturing and vehicle assembly, did not shut down overnight, the ripple effects were unmistakable. Suppliers began warning of impending price hikes, logistics teams scrambled to find alternative sources, and investor confidence wavered, causing Tesla's stock to fluctuate. A carefully constructed and efficient supply chain was suddenly destabilized by Canada's shift in trade policy. What sets this situation apart is the nature of the relationship between the two countries. Unlike past US trade disputes, which have often involved geopolitical rivals such as China, this disruption stems from a close ally. Canada's decision isn't retaliatory or defensive; rather, it is a calculated, strategic move aimed at advancing its own economic goals and securing a more competitive stance in the growing clean energy economy. The timing couldn't be more critical. Battery production is already one of the most volatile and cost-intensive aspects of EV manufacturing. Unlike traditional auto components, batteries depend on highly specific raw materials that are difficult to replace, making the supply chain especially vulnerable. If prices rise or the supply of critical materials becomes unpredictable, automakers face two difficult choices: raise vehicle prices or absorb the added costs, which would eat into already thin profit margins. Neither option is ideal, particularly in a highly competitive global market where consumers expect both affordability and innovation. This challenge isn't unique to Tesla; it impacts the entire American electric vehicle (EV) strategy, which hinges on cutting carbon emissions and reducing dependence on fossil fuels. A stable and affordable supply of key materials, many of which come from abroad, is essential to that strategy. Canada, for instance, is one of the United States' leading suppliers of lithium and nickel, two critical components in EV battery production. As a result, recent changes in Canadian policy are more than just a business matter; they could become a significant obstacle to achieving US climate goals. From Canada's perspective, however, this shift is not an act of hostility but a strategic recalibration. By leveraging its role as a major provider of critical minerals, Canada is signaling that it wants a larger share of the clean energy value chain. Despite its long-standing investments in green technology, much of the manufacturing and brand recognition has historically benefited the US. Now, Canadian policymakers are making it clear that they want more of the economic benefits: more factories, more jobs, and more value, located within their own borders. With global demand for electric vehicles continuing to grow, Canada sees this as the opportune moment to assert its interests and reshape the dynamics of the North American EV industry. For Tesla, and the broader American EV sector, this presents both a challenge and a call to adapt. The timing couldn't be worse for Elon Musk and Tesla. The company is already navigating a tough landscape marked by rising interest rates, intense competition from traditional automakers, and persistent regulatory hurdles. Now, with the imposition of new tariffs, the situation grows even more complicated. Unlike some of its rivals, Tesla hasn't significantly diversified its supply chain. While Musk has consistently championed vertical integration, managing everything from mining to manufacturing, Tesla remains heavily reliant on international suppliers for many essential materials. Canada's recent move could force Tesla to rethink this approach altogether. To maintain access to critical resources, the company may need to invest heavily in Canadian infrastructure or establish new local partnerships. Such a shift would be far from minor. It could entail billions in investments, major operational restructuring, and potential production delays. However, the implications extend well beyond Tesla. Canada's strategy of leveraging its natural resources in trade negotiations signals a broader global trend. As the world transitions to clean energy, control over key raw materials is emerging as a powerful form of economic influence. Just as oil defined global power dynamics in the 20th century, the 21st century is being shaped by access to lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. Nations that possess or control the export of these vital resources are beginning to wield outsized influence on the global stage, a challenge that the United States must now confront. The United States has yet to build sufficient domestic capacity to insulate itself from external supply shocks, despite its vast potential. The American mining industry, in particular, has been hampered by decades of underinvestment. Opening new mines is a long and complex process, often taking years and facing significant pushback from environmental groups, along with burdensome regulatory hurdles. These challenges make it extremely difficult to respond swiftly to disruptions in global supply chains. This reality underscores a critical issue: America's clean energy ambitions remain heavily dependent on foreign resources. Recent developments with Canada further emphasize this point. Even close allies are willing to adopt tough measures when their national interests are at stake, a move that isn't necessarily unfair, but rather a stark reminder of the increasingly tight connection between geopolitics and climate policy. This shift became clear when Canada introduced new tariffs and export restrictions on critical materials vital for electric vehicle (EV) production. While media attention largely focused on Tesla, the policy change was about more than just one company. It signaled a broader transformation in the structure of the North American auto supply chain. For years, car manufacturers in the US, Canada, and Mexico operated within a deeply integrated network. Auto parts routinely crossed borders, with vehicles often moving between the US and Canada multiple times before final assembly. Canada's once seamless economic system is beginning to show signs of strain, and the pressure is becoming increasingly visible. A clear indication of this shift is a recent proposal from the New Democratic Party, a 100% tariff on Tesla vehicles entering the country, coupled with a $10,000 subsidy for every electric vehicle manufactured within Canada. This bold, two-pronged strategy is designed to penalize the foreign EV leader while providing substantial incentives for domestic producers. On the surface, it may appear to be traditional protectionism, but it represents something more deliberate and sophisticated. This emerging approach is being dubbed green nationalism, a policy framework that leverages climate initiatives not only to reduce emissions but also to realign economic priorities in favor of national interests. Rather than being driven by outdated notions of nationalism or simple fear of foreign imports, it reflects a strategic effort to enhance Canada's economic competitiveness while appealing to voter concerns about climate change, job security, and sustainable development. The policy is already yielding tangible results. Canadian operations of major automakers like Ford and GM are receiving renewed attention, and Volkswagen is moving forward with plans for a large-scale battery manufacturing plant in Ontario. The trend is clear: companies that base their production in Canada stand to gain significant advantages, particularly by accessing generous local subsidies. In doing so, Canada positions itself not only as a committed player in the clean energy transition but also as a nation determined to build a resilient, future-ready economy. To avoid the burden of new tariffs, Canadian manufacturing plants are gaining a competitive edge over their US counterparts, especially as global automakers strive to balance cost management with environmental goals. Ironically, some of this momentum traces back to earlier US policies under the Trump administration, when electric vehicles, EVs, were integrated into broader strategies addressing climate change and industrial revitalization. However, shifting political priorities and rising trade tensions have since complicated those initiatives. The current dispute with Canada threatens to undermine the original vision. If American automakers like Tesla, Ford, or General Motors face rising costs due to trade barriers and supply chain disruptions, producing affordable EVs becomes increasingly difficult. Affordability remains one of the biggest challenges in EV adoption, not range or charging infrastructure. If average consumers are priced out of the transition from gasoline to electric, the broader clean energy shift slows, resulting in prolonged emissions and a delayed response to the climate crisis. The North American EV strategy was founded on scaling production and integrating supply chains across borders to drive down costs. With that framework now in jeopardy, there's a significant risk that adoption will stagnate. Meanwhile, Canada has evolved from a cooperative partner to a nation aiming to lead the EV movement, with ambitions extending far beyond simply increasing vehicle output. It's about reshaping the rules of trade that have defined US-Canada relations for decades. Canada and the United States once enjoyed a trade relationship built on mutual benefit, where each country focused on its strengths and their interlinked industries thrived on efficiency. However, Canada's recent actions indicate a shift away from that cooperative model in favor of retaining more economic value within its own borders. This new approach is not without risks. The United States could respond with its own retaliatory trade measures, and some Canadian industries may suffer as a result. Nonetheless, Canadian leadership seems prepared to take that gamble, believing that gaining long-term control over emerging green industries justifies the short-term friction. Given the growing global demand for electric vehicles, EVs, their bet may prove to be well placed. One of the most telling signs of how fragile the previous system has become is the outsized impact a single policy change can now have. In today's automotive industry, a single vehicle may cross the US-Canada border 5 or 6 times during production. Engines might be built in Windsor, tested in Michigan, and sent back across the border for final assembly. Aluminum frames could come from Quebec, dashboards from the US Midwest, and wiring harnesses from Mexico. This intricate supply chain depends heavily on seamless trade. But that system is now showing cracks. As soon as Canada introduced its new trade restrictions, major automakers reacted. Ford warned of production delays, GM halted work at several plants, and suppliers began laying off workers. What was once a finely tuned machine is now under significant strain, and it's becoming clear this isn't just a temporary disruption. The current situation could signify the beginning of a new era in North American manufacturing. At its core, this is a structural issue. Many factories were established based on the premise of low-cost, tariff-free trade. Operating with already narrow profit margins, these facilities are highly vulnerable to rising raw material costs and shipping delays, which can severely disrupt production schedules. The greater concern lies in what the future may hold. If raw material prices continue to escalate, political tensions intensify trade barriers, and cross-border operations remain sluggish, the viability of some factories could come into question. This would mean more than just temporary layoffs, it could lead to permanent shutdowns. Communities across Ontario, Ohio, and other manufacturing hubs that depend on these plants may face the permanent loss of long-standing jobs. This issue extends beyond production figures and logistics. It's a reflection of the fragility of a deeply interconnected economic system. For decades, the North American auto industry was hailed as a model of successful cross-border collaboration, giving the region a competitive edge by enabling vehicles to be manufactured more quickly and affordably than almost anywhere else. Now, that very system is facing significant threats, with no straightforward solution in sight. Meanwhile, Canada's new economic strategy, which integrates environmental goals and domestic job protection into trade decisions, is prompting broader questions about the future of economic policy. If this approach gains traction, other nations may soon adopt similar strategies, potentially reshaping the global trade landscape. Global trade is shifting toward a model that prioritizes climate policies, labor standards, and supply chain sovereignty, fundamentally reshaping how and where companies operate. We may be entering a new era where trade agreements extend well beyond traditional concerns like tariffs and quotas. Increasingly, these agreements are incorporating climate regulations, labor protections, and control over national supply chains. This represents a significant departure from the globalization model that most industries have come to rely on. The familiar pattern of global supply chains spanning continents is being re-evaluated, with governments now placing far greater emphasis on the origin of key materials and the level of control they hold over domestic production systems. We may be entering a new era where trade agreements extend well beyond traditional concerns like tariffs and quotas. Increasingly, these agreements are incorporating climate regulations, labor protections, and control over national supply chains. This represents a significant departure from the globalization model that most industries have come to rely on. The familiar pattern of global supply chains spanning continents is being re-evaluated, with governments now placing far greater emphasis on the origin of key materials and the level of control they hold over domestic production systems. This shift is being accelerated by the global transition toward clean energy and electric transportation. Countries such as Canada are responding decisively, implementing bold policies that could serve as a model for others. If Canada's approach proves successful, by generating employment, opening new manufacturing facilities, and strengthening the national economy, it may prompt allied nations to follow suit. This could lead to an uptick in tariffs, stricter export controls, and a greater dependence on government subsidies as instruments of economic policy. For the United States, this evolution presents both a challenge and a potential turning point. In this evolving landscape, companies will need to exhibit unprecedented adaptability. Success will no longer be defined solely by product quality or brand strength but also by strategic decisions regarding manufacturing locations and supply chain configurations. These dynamics began to take shape when the Trump administration introduced initial tariffs, marking the beginning of a broader transformation that continues to reshape global commerce today. The message was clear: bring jobs back home. The goal was to rebuild American industry and create a level playing field for workers who had been left behind by decades of outsourcing and automation. For many struggling communities, this message offered hope. Tariffs were seen as a potential turning point, a chance to revive blue-collar work. For a while, it seemed to be working, some factories reopened, and there was renewed optimism about reshoring manufacturing. However, that vision is now starting to unravel as trade tensions with Canada escalate. Ironically, the very workers who were meant to benefit are among those suffering the most. Plants already operating on thin margins are facing rising costs for materials like aluminum and steel. Cross-border logistics, which used to run smoothly, are now hampered by new tariffs and regulatory uncertainties. Production delays are becoming more frequent, forcing manufacturers to make tough decisions, cutting shifts, laying off workers, or shutting down operations entirely. General Motors has already scaled back output at several U.S. plants due to higher input costs and supply chain issues. Ford has warned that more job cuts may follow if trade disruptions continue, and Stellantis, one of the world's largest carmakers, has mentioned temporary plant closures as a possibility. These examples are not isolated incidents but part of a broader pattern of strain on a system that once supported millions of middle-class jobs. The emotional toll of these job losses is impossible to overlook in communities that were once promised a new era of stability and opportunity. Now, a growing sense of disillusionment has taken hold. Many of these workers dedicated their lives to building the backbone of America's industrial economy, only to see their paychecks shrink and their job security disappear, not because of low-cost overseas competition, but due to a trade dispute with a close ally. This stark contradiction highlights how tariffs, originally designed to shield American workers from foreign threats, are instead creating the very challenges they aim to prevent. While the goal was to bolster domestic manufacturing, the added costs have made it increasingly difficult for the industry to compete. Given the highly interconnected nature of the North American auto industry, disruptions in one area cascade throughout the entire network. Even suppliers not directly targeted by tariffs are feeling the pressure. When a major automaker slows or halts production, the impact reverberates down the line, leaving smaller manufacturers of parts and components suddenly without orders. Many of these smaller businesses lack the financial resilience to endure such sudden demand drops, forcing some to reduce operations and others to close permanently. The consequences extend beyond car manufacturing, spreading through related industries and further deepening the economic strain. When large factories scale back or shut down, local economies suffer significantly. This impacts not only logistics, warehousing, and repair services but also local retail businesses. With fewer people earning steady incomes, small businesses such as restaurants, shops, and service providers begin to lose customers, triggering a chain reaction that can destabilize entire communities. As these economic challenges become more apparent, the political ramifications are increasingly difficult to ignore. Many of the regions hardest hit by the trade war, key battlegrounds in U.S. elections like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, have seen blue-collar voters play a crucial role in flipping seats and determining presidential outcomes. However, with job losses rising and economic uncertainty deepening, frustration is growing. The initial enthusiasm for the "America First" message is fading, as polls indicate that voters in traditionally conservative manufacturing areas are beginning to doubt whether current trade policies are fulfilling their promises. Behind the scenes, strategists from both major parties are growing concerned. For Republicans, the risk is clear: the policies that once energized their base in 2016 and 2020 are now increasingly associated with economic hardship. For Democrats, the challenge is to present a convincing alternative that addresses economic struggles without repeating past errors. Meanwhile, divisions are emerging even within the GOP itself. Some members, particularly those connected to the business community, are calling for a re-evaluation of the trade approach. They warn that ongoing conflicts with allies like Canada could harm the party's reputation on economic matters. Meanwhile, others aligned with the populist wing remain steadfast, arguing that the current difficulties are temporary and a necessary sacrifice for long-term benefits. They often blame foreign governments or global corporations for the setbacks. However, for families facing job losses, rising prices, and declining financial stability, political debates offer little comfort. People are being asked to be patient and wait for policies to take effect, but bills need to be paid now. The cost of living continues to rise, vehicles are more expensive, repairs take longer, and even used cars, once a reliable and affordable option, have surged in price. Maintenance has also become more challenging, with car parts harder to find and more costly than in previous years. A combination of semiconductor shortages, rising material costs, and shipping delays has transformed routine car repairs into long waits and unexpected expenses. For families relying on a single vehicle for work, school, or medical needs, these issues are more than inconvenient, they are disruptive. In rural areas and smaller cities with limited public transportation, the impact is even more severe, as owning a vehicle is often not a luxury but a necessity. As prices rise and reliability declines, families face difficult decisions, whether to hold on to aging cars that are costly to maintain, take on debt to replace them, or cut back on other expenses just to get by. This situation contributes to growing economic anxiety, which extends beyond auto workers and affects multiple industries across the country. Americans are under increasing pressure as wages fail to keep up with inflation, while rent, groceries, and fuel consume a larger portion of their paychecks. At the same time, climbing interest rates make borrowing more expensive, further straining household budgets. For many families, it feels as though no matter how hard they work, it's never enough. This emerging reality may be an early sign of a broader global shift, one that could reshape how power, production, and influence are distributed worldwide. While the United States grapples with economic conflicts and internal political divisions, other countries are quietly advancing, strengthening alliances, and building strength in key sectors, most notably, electric vehicles. The critical question now is whether the US can keep pace. For decades, the United States was considered the cornerstone of the global economy, with its manufacturing power, trade agreements, and leadership helping to shape international markets and policies. However, in recent years, that image has begun to fade. Political instability, changing policy priorities, and a rise in nationalist sentiment have caused even close allies to reconsider their long-term commitments to the US. Canada's recent trade decisions reflect a broader global shift, with China capitalizing on opportunities as the United States contends with internal divisions and strained alliances. China has been strategically cultivating new relationships, securing supply chains, and investing heavily in future-oriented industries. A key part of this strategy involves targeting Canadian companies engaged in the extraction and refinement of critical minerals such as lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite, essential components for electric vehicle batteries. Control over these minerals provides a significant competitive edge in the global race to lead the green economy. Chinese firms are offering Canadian mining companies long-term contracts, infrastructure investments, and joint ventures, signaling a deliberate, long-term approach rather than short-term deals. China's ambition extends beyond leading electric vehicle production to becoming the primary supplier of the materials that power the entire industry. Meanwhile, Canada, feeling increasingly overlooked by the United States, is more receptive to these new partnerships. This shift is not only economic but symbolic. Historically, Canada was viewed as the US's most dependable economic ally, with tightly integrated supply chains in sectors like automotive and energy. However, rising trade tensions and a growing US protectionist stance have prompted Canada to reconsider its position. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney's leadership, Canada is emphasizing economic sovereignty and independence, focusing on critical minerals and expanding its ties with Europe and Asia. The result is a transformed global trade landscape, distinct from the post-World War II order shaped by the US. New trade agreements are increasingly being forged without American involvement, and global companies are redirecting investments from traditional US manufacturing hubs to regions like Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. Developing nations, too, are selecting new partners, reflecting this evolving economic reality. There is a noticeable shift in global investment patterns, with many investors now favoring sources free from political strings, often choosing options outside of Washington's influence, such as China or the European Union. This trend spans a variety of industries, including agriculture, semiconductors, and heavy manufacturing, but is particularly evident in the electric vehicle (EV) sector. South Korea's Hyundai and Kia have made significant advancements in EV innovation, launching new models that have gained international recognition. Similarly, German automotive giants like Volkswagen and BMW are fully committing to electrification, supported by consistent government policies and well-managed supply chains. Even emerging players like Vietnam are making their mark. VinFast, a Vietnamese EV company, is expanding into global markets, including the United States. These companies' successes are not just a result of merit but also stem from the unpredictable nature of American policies. One of the biggest challenges for U.S. industry is not a lack of innovation or talent but rather the inconsistency in policy. Trade policies and subsidies in the U.S. often change dramatically with each administration, creating uncertainty as subsidies are introduced, removed, or altered depending on which party is in power. Frequent changes in immigration laws further complicate long-term planning for companies, contributing to an unstable business environment. For example, while the U.S. offers federal subsidies for EVs and green infrastructure, this support is often insufficient or unevenly distributed, making it difficult for businesses to rely on steady government backing. Some incentives are tied to strict domestic manufacturing rules that exclude even close allies, while others face delays due to legal battles or political pushback. This has created a fragmented and unreliable system, especially when compared to the clear and consistent frameworks found in other countries. Meanwhile, raw material costs in the U.S. continue to rise, partly driven by tariffs on imported metals and components. Labor shortages are worsening, fueled by an aging population and lower immigration rates. Additionally, the country's polarized political climate complicates efforts to pass or sustain large-scale economic reforms. These challenges are slowing what was once seen as a world-leading effort toward electrification. This situation is not just a temporary disruption but represents a fundamental restructuring of global supply chains. Companies are increasingly diversifying production, spreading risk, and reducing their dependence on American markets and policies. The consequences are tangible: fewer jobs, fewer factories, and diminished influence for the U.S. in some of the fastest-growing industries of the future. In the past, the U.S. could rely on its size and technological edge to lead the way, but in today's economy, that is no longer sufficient. Success now depends on stable trade relationships, consistent policy, and long-term investments in infrastructure and workforce development. Without these foundations, even the most innovative American companies risk falling behind, and the long-term implications are serious as countries like China, Germany, and South Korea advance their positions. As Korea strengthens its grip on the electric vehicle (EV) market, the United States faces the risk of not only struggling to compete but potentially being sidelined altogether in shaping the future of global transportation. This shift carries profound economic and geopolitical consequences, as dominance in green technology translates into significant influence over climate policy, energy markets, and even military logistics. Such soft power could rival oil in strategic importance. To remain a major player, the U.S. must rethink its approach by rebuilding trust with allies like Canada, implementing clearer and more reliable policies, and reinvesting in domestic industries that have weakened over time. Today, global leadership is no longer defined solely by the size of an economy but by dependability and sustained commitment. Fortunately, the U.S. still possesses the talent, financial resources, and industrial heritage necessary to reclaim its leadership role. However, achieving this will require long-term vision and consistent focus, qualities that have often been missing in recent years. Without such dedication, the world will continue advancing while the U.S. risks falling behind in sectors it once dominated. Signs of this transformation are already visible in regions such as Ontario, Bavaria, and Seoul, but the most significant changes are unfolding quietly in boardrooms, government meetings, and investment strategies as trade routes shift and alliances evolve. Ultimately, the global economy is changing rapidly, and the decisions America makes now will determine whether it remains at the heart of this evolution or becomes a mere bystander in a game it once led.